Sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got nothing left to lose but his honor. When they took everything that mattered from Eli Varn, they made the biggest mistake of their lives. The mountain man from Bitter Hollow rode into Coyote Gulch after 5 years gone, and the whole town gathered in the saloon to see what all the fuss was about. He wasn't there to drink or talk, just stood quiet by the bar as the sheriff and his men surrounded him. "You killed 9 of Clay Barrow's men?" the sheriff asked, his voice shaking. Eli didn't flinch. 10, one more followed me. The silence that followed said everything. Folks had heard the stories, but seeing the blood on his boots made it real. But what drove this quiet man to take on an entire gang? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 years earlier, Bitter Hollow was the kind of place where a man could find peace if he'd earned it. Nestled deep in the Montana Territory's most unforgiving mountains, it sat like a hidden jewel among towering pines and granite peaks that scraped the belly of heaven itself. The valley stretched maybe 3 miles end to end, with a crystal-clear stream running right down the middle, fed by snowmelt that never seemed to stop flowing. Even in the driest summers, Eli Varn had built his cabin on the eastern slope, where the morning sun would catch the windows just right and warm the kitchen where his wife Sarah would start her day. The structure was solid, thick pine logs chinked with clay and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke, clean and true, and a wraparound porch where they'd sit in the evenings, watching the mist rise from the valley floor like spirits dancing in the fading light. Sarah Elizabeth Varn was a woman who could make a home out of nothing more than love and determination. She'd followed Eli up that mountain path 3 years after Appomattox, when the war was finally done, bleeding the country dry, and he'd decided he'd seen enough of what men could do to each other. She had auburn hair that caught fire in the sunset, and hands that could gentle a spooked horse or stitch a wound with equal skill. When she laughed, which was often in those days, it echoed off the canyon walls like church bells calling the faithful home. Eli himself was a different man then. Still carried the lean strength of his cavalry days, still moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd learned that noise could get you killed. But the hard edges had softened some. The war had taught him to kill, but Sarah had taught him to live again. He'd traded his Army-issue Colt for a hunting rifle and spent his days trapping beaver and marten, selling the pelts down in Coyote Gulch when winter supplies ran low. The cabin held their dreams like a cupped hand holds water. Sarah had started a garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil with the same patience she'd used to coax the nightmares from Eli's sleep. They talked about children, about maybe adding a room or 2 when the time came. Eli had even started clearing timber for a proper barn, thinking ahead to the horses they'd need when their family grew. Their nearest neighbors were members of the Blackfoot tribe who'd made seasonal camps in the northern part of the valley for generations. Chief Running Bear was an old warrior who'd seen enough of the changing world to value friendship over old grudges. He and Eli had developed a respectful relationship built on shared hunts and traded knowledge. The chief's grandson, a young brave named Swifthawk, often brought news from the outside world and sometimes stayed for Sarah's cooking, which had become legendary even among folks who'd never seen the inside of their cabin. Those were the golden years, when time seemed to slow down to match the rhythm of the seasons. Eli would rise before dawn to check his trap lines, moving through the forest like a ghost, reading sign and weather with skills honed by 20 years of staying alive in hostile territory. He knew every deer path, every hidden spring, every cave where a man could weather a blizzard. The mountains had become his cathedral, and solitude his prayer. But peace, Eli had learned, was something you borrowed rather than owned. And the note always came due. Clay Barrow arrived in the Montana Territory like a plague of locusts, buying up land and pushing out anyone who wouldn't sell. He was a big man with bigger appetites, cattle, gold, timber. It didn't matter as long as it turned a profit. Back in Kansas, He'd built an empire on the bones of smaller ranchers, using hired guns to encourage reluctant sellers and corrupt sheriffs to look the other way. Montana represented fresh territory, new opportunities, and fewer people asking inconvenient questions about his methods. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp October morning when Eli found survey stakes driven into the ground near his southern property line. Someone had marked off sections of land that included part of his pasture and most of the creek that fed his water supply. When he pulled up the stakes and followed their trail, he found they led all the way down to the main road, part of a grand design that would fence off the entire valley. Sarah had been hanging laundry when he returned with the news. She took it the way she took most things, with calm determination and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated. "This is our home." "Eli," she said, pinning one of his shirts to the line with perhaps more force than necessary, "we built this life fair and square. No man has the right to take it from us." Eli knew she was right, but he also knew the type of man who put survey stakes on another person's land without asking permission first. Still, he tried the civilized approach. He rode down to Coyote Gulch and asked around until he found Clay Barrow holding court in the Silver Dollar Saloon, surrounded by men who looked like they'd been born with guns in their hands instead of rattles. Barrow was everything Eli had expected. Soft around the middle, but hard around the eyes, with the kind of smile that never reached past his teeth. He wore expensive clothes that didn't quite hide the Colt Navy revolver on his hip, and when he spoke, he had the smooth confidence of a man who'd never heard the word no, and meant to keep it that way. "Mr. Vaughn," Barrow had said, not bothering to stand or extend his hand. "I've been hoping we'd have a chance to talk business." "My land's not for sale," Eli replied, keeping his voice level and his hands visible. The saloon had gone quiet around them, and he could feel the weight of hostile stares from Barrow's men. "Everything's for sale, friend. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Barrow's smile widened. "I'm prepared to be generous. That valley of yours is isolated, hard to defend. Accidents happen in country like that. It would be a shame if something unfortunate befell you and your lovely wife." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, acrid and unmistakable. Eli felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar sensation he'd hoped never to feel again. It was the moment when civilization fell away, and you remembered that at heart men were still wolves, and wolves understood only strength. "I'll be going now," Eli said quietly. "But I want you to understand something, Mr. Barrow. That valley is my home, my wife's home. If you or any of your men come calling uninvited, you won't like what you find waiting." He'd left then, feeling their eyes on his back like target marks. But he'd made his position clear, and he thought that might be the end of it. Men like Barrow usually preferred easier prey, softer targets who would fold at the first sign of pressure. He couldn't have been more wrong. The attacks started small, subtle things that could have been accidents or bad luck if you didn't know better. Trap lines cut, horses spooked from their pickets, supplies that went missing from his cache sites. Eli recognized the pattern from his army days, the slow pressure campaign designed to wear down an enemy's resolve before the real assault began. But Sarah refused to be driven out. She'd planted roots too deep to abandon, and she met each new harassment with the quiet courage that had first attracted Eli to her. When someone poisoned their well, she helped him dig a new one. When their winter supply of firewood was scattered and ruined, she worked beside him to split fresh logs before the snows came. "They think they can make us run," she told him one evening as they sat by their fire, her head resting against his shoulder. "But we're not the running kind, are we?" Eli touched the simple gold band on her finger, feeling the smooth warmth of metal that had been worn thin by years of honest work. In his pocket, he carried a matching ring, his wedding band that he'd taken off each morning before heading out to check traps, a habit born from too many close calls where jewelry could catch on something at the worst possible moment. "No," he said, pulling her closer. "We're not the running kind." But he knew that soon enough, running wouldn't be an option for either of them. Clay Barrow was the kind of man who took what he wanted, and he wanted their valley. Eli had seen his type before in the war, men who confused cruelty with strength, who believed that might always made right. The difference was that back then, Eli had been a soldier with orders and a uniform that gave him the legal authority to fight back. Now he was just a mountain man trying to protect what was his, and the law was whatever Clay Barrow said it was. But Eli Varn had been protecting things that mattered to him for most of his adult life, and he was very, very good at it. The snow came early that year, blanketing Bitter Hollow in a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. November had barely begun when the first blizzard swept down from the peaks, dumping 3 feet of powder and sealing the valley off from the outside world until spring. For most folks, winter isolation was something to endure. For Eli and Sarah, it was a blessing. Months of peace where no one could reach them, where they could pretend that Clay Barrow and his threats were nothing more than a bad dream. Sarah had been feeling poorly that week, though she tried to hide it from Eli. She'd started losing her breakfast most mornings and had taken to napping in the afternoons, something that wasn't like her at all. When he pressed her about seeing Doc Peterson down in town, she'd just smiled and placed his hand on her still flat belly. "I don't think Doc Peterson can help with this particular condition," she'd said, her eyes bright with secret joy. "But come spring, we're going to need that extra room you've been planning." Eli had gone still as a hunting cat, his mind struggling to process what she was telling him. Then the truth hit him like a lightning strike, and he'd swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she laughed and begged him to put her down before he made her dizzy. A baby. Their baby. The future they'd dreamed about was finally taking shape, growing beneath Sarah's heart like hope made flesh. That night, as the wind howled outside their snug cabin, they'd made plans. They'd need a cradle. Eli could carve one from the beautiful piece of cherry wood he'd been saving for something special. Sarah would need to start sewing clothes and blankets. They'd have to expand the garden come spring, lay in more supplies, maybe even think about getting a milk cow. For 3 perfect days, their world was complete. On the 4th day, Eli was out checking the snares he'd set near the northern ridge when he saw the smoke. Not the thin grey wisp from his own chimney, but a thick black column rising from the direction of his cabin. Dark against the pristine sky, like a scar across heaven itself, he ran through snow that grabbed at his boots and branches that tore at his coat, his heart hammering against his ribs as the acrid smell of burning wood filled his nostrils. Behind the smoke, he could see the orange glow of flames dancing against the mountain walls, and he knew with terrible certainty that his world was ending. The cabin was already half consumed when he broke through the tree line. Flames licked through the roof like hungry tongues, and the windows glowed like the eyes of some hellish beast. The porch, where they'd spent so many peaceful evenings, was a skeleton of burning timber, and the door hung open like a screaming mouth. Sarah! Her name tore from his throat as he fought his way through the heat and smoke, but there was no answer except the roar of the fire. The interior was an inferno, walls, furniture, everything they'd built together, dissolving into ash and memory. He found her in their bedroom, or what was left of it. She lay on the floor beside their bed, her auburn hair spread around her head like spilled wine. For one desperate moment he thought she might just be unconscious, overcome by smoke. Then he saw the blood pooling beneath her, dark and still, and the impossible angle of her neck. They hadn't just burned his home. They'd killed his wife. They'd murdered his unborn child. Eli dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he touched her face. Her skin was still warm, her eyes closed as if she were sleeping. But there was no breath in her lungs, no pulse in her throat. The woman who'd brought laughter to his mountain was gone, and with her went every reason he'd had for choosing peace over war. He stayed with her until the fire drove him back, cradling her body against his chest while the flames consumed everything they'd built together. When the roof finally collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, he carried her outside and laid her gently in the snow. his tears freezing on his cheeks as he looked down at the woman who'd saved his soul. That's when he heard the laughter. It came from the tree line across the clearing. Harsh, mocking sounds that cut through the night like broken glass. 3 men stepped out of the shadows, and even in the firelight, Eli recognized them as part of Barrow's crew. Jake Holloway, a mean-eyed killer from Texas. Pete Rawlings, who'd been bragging in the saloons about what he'd do to any homesteader who didn't know when to quit. And Tom Brennan, a half-breed gunfighter with dead eyes and quick hands. "Looks like your missus didn't want to leave after all," Holloway called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "Had to convince her the hard way. Boss said to make sure you got the message," Rawlings added, his hand resting on his gun butt. "This valley belongs to Clay Barrow now. You can ride out come spring, or you can join your woman in the ground. Your choice." Eli rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate and controlled. The grief was still there, a wound so deep it might never heal, but something else was rising alongside it, something cold and sharp and utterly without mercy. He'd felt it before, in the war, when civilized men had to do uncivilized things to survive. But this was different. This was personal. "You killed my wife," he said, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were commenting on the weather. "We killed a stubborn woman who wouldn't listen to reason," Brennan replied, his hand moving to hover near his Colt. "Now we're killing a stubborn man for the same reason." They drew together, 3 professionals who'd done this dance before. But Eli had been killing men since before any of them had grown whiskers, and grief had stripped away every restraint he'd learned in the years since the war ended. His own gun seemed to appear in his hand without conscious thought. The familiar weight of the Colt Peacemaker, as natural as breathing. The first shot took Holloway center mass, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the snow. The second caught Rawlings in the throat as he tried to clear leather, sending him stumbling backward with blood spraying from his ruined windpipe. Brennan was fast, faster than the other 2, but not fast enough. His bullet went wide as Eli's third shot punched through his chest, driving him to his knees in the snow. He stayed upright for a moment, looking down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with something like surprise, then toppled forward and lay still. The gunshots echoed off the mountain walls and faded into silence, leaving only the crackle of the dying fire and the whisper of falling snow. Eli stood among the bodies, smoke rising from the barrel of his gun, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The man who'd chosen peace over war was dead, buried under the same roof that had sheltered his murdered wife. What remained was something harder, colder, a weapon pointed at the heart of Clay Barrow's empire. Eli holstered his gun and knelt beside Sarah one last time. He slipped her wedding ring from her finger and placed it in his pocket next to his own, the 2 pieces of gold clicking together like a promise. Then he gathered stones from the creek bed and built a cairn over her body, marking the spot where his old life had ended and his new purpose had been born. Before he left Bitter Hollow for the last time, he took one thing from the ruins of his home, a skinning knife with the bone handle that Sarah had given him for his birthday. The blade was still sharp, the steel unmarked by the fire that had taken everything else. By morning he was gone, disappeared into the high country like smoke on the wind. But Clay Barrow's men had started something they couldn't finish. And Eli Varn was going to teach them the difference between a mountain man at peace and a mountain man at war. The lesson was going to be written in blood. The high country in winter was a place where weak men died and strong men learned just how close to the edge they really lived. Eli Varn had spent the last 2 months moving through the peaks like a ghost with a grudge, living off cached supplies and what game he could take with snares and deadfalls. He'd grown lean as a wolf and twice as dangerous, his beard thick with ice and his eyes holding the kind of emptiness that came from staring too long into the abyss. The war had taught him patience. But grief had taught him something else entirely, how to nurse rage like a carefully tended fire, banking the coals until the moment came to let it burn everything in its path. He'd been watching Clay Barrow's operation from the high ridges, learning the patterns of the patrols, counting the men, mapping their camps and supply routes. Barrow had brought in more guns since the trouble started. Hard cases from Texas and Colorado who wore their weapons like other men wore their boots, natural and necessary. They'd set up a main camp in the old mining settlement at Dead Horse Creek, using the abandoned buildings as barracks and storehouses. From his hiding place among the rocks, Eli could see the whole layout spread out below him like a military installation. Guard posts at the natural approaches, sentries walking regular beats, even a rough stable for their horses. It was the kind of setup that would have impressed his old cavalry commander, professional, thorough, and designed to withstand a sustained assault. But Eli wasn't planning an assault. He was planning a hunt. The first one died on a Tuesday morning, 3 miles from the main camp. Billy Hodges was a young punk from Kansas who'd signed on with Barrow for the easy money, thinking that pushing around mountain farmers would be simpler than facing down armed men on the frontier. He'd been riding the Southern Patrol route alone, confident in his quick draw and the reputation of the men behind him. Eli took him from 100 yards with a single rifle shot, clean through the heart. By the time the other patrols found his horse wandering riderless back to camp, his body was already covered with fresh snow, and the mountain man was miles away, moving through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. The second kill came 3 days later. Frank Dalton, no relation to the famous outlaws, despite what he told folks in saloons, was watering his horse at a creek when something made him look up. The last thing he saw was a figure in buckskins emerging from the trees like death in winter clothes. Eli's knife took him in the throat before he could even think about reaching for his gun. This time Eli left a message. He carved 3 words into a tree beside the body. "For my Sarah." Word spread fast among Barrow's men that they had a serious problem. The easy job of intimidating homesteaders had suddenly become a deadly game of cat and mouse, with someone who knew these mountains better than they knew their own mothers' faces. The patrol started traveling in groups of 3 or 4, but that just made them slower and easier to track. Eli struck again on Sunday, picking off a scout named Murphy from long range as the man tried to find his trail. Then he disappeared for a week, letting fear do its work on the survivors. He knew from experience that waiting was often deadlier than bullets. Men's imaginations were more terrible than any enemy they could see and fight. Clay Barrow himself rode up to Dead Horse Creek to see what all the fuss was about. He was a man who'd built his empire on fear and intimidation, and the idea that some mountain hermit was picking off his hired guns like ducks in a shooting gallery was more than his pride could stand. "How many men has he killed?" Barrow demanded, pacing back and forth in front of the main building while his remaining crew watched nervously. "4 so far," replied his foreman, a grizzled killer named Sam Crutchfield who'd been with him since the Kansas days. "But it ain't just the killings, boss. It's the way he's doing it, like he's playing with us." "Playing?" Barrow's voice rose an octave. "4 of my best men are dead, and you think this is some kind of game?" "That's just it," Crutchfield said, lowering his voice. "They weren't our best men. He's been picking off the weak ones, the careless ones. It's like he's culling the herd, getting rid of the chaff before he comes for the real fighters." The truth of that statement settled over the camp like a cold fog. Eli wasn't just killing randomly. He was being selective, strategic. Every man he'd taken had been alone, separated from the group, vulnerable. He was reducing their numbers while simultaneously testing their defenses, learning their weaknesses. "We need to draw him out," Barrow decided. "Set a trap! Make him come to us on our terms!" "With respect, boss," Crutchfield replied, "this ain't Kansas. Up here, he's got every advantage. He knows the country. He's got places to hide we'll never find, and Winter's on his side. Maybe we should consider..." "Consider what?" Barrow's hand dropped to his gun butt. "Running? Abandoning everything I've worked for because one man with a grudge got lucky a few times." Crutchfield knew better than to push the point. Clay Barrow hadn't built his empire by backing down from fights, even when backing down was the smart play. Pride was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, and right now it was driving him toward a confrontation that could cost them all their lives. "What do you want us to do?" Crutchfield asked. "Double the guards, set up overlapping fields of fire around the camp, and post a reward. $500 for this mountain man, dead or alive. That's a lot of money, boss." "It's a lot less than what he's already cost me," Barrow replied grimly. "And I want it known that the offer extends to anyone who can bring me information about him. Where he's hiding, how he's moving, what he's planning." But Eli Varn wasn't hiding in the conventional sense. He was moving through his own country like water through stone, following paths he'd learned over 5 years of calling these mountains home. He had supply caches hidden in places no white man had ever seen. Shelters carved into cliff faces that were invisible from more than 20 feet away. More importantly, he had allies that Barrow didn't know about. Chief Running Bear found him on a snowy ridge 2 weeks after the killing started. The old warrior appeared out of the storm like a spirit, his face grim with news from the valley below. "Your enemy brings more men," Running Bear said without preamble. 20 new guns from the south. "They speak of burning out my people if we help you." Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I never meant to bring trouble to your tribe." "Trouble was coming whether you fought or not," the chief replied. "This Barrow wants all the land, not just yours. He has told his men that Indians have no claim to territory that could be used for cattle." The 2 men stood in the swirling snow, understanding passing between them without words. This wasn't just about Eli's murdered wife anymore. It was about everything decent people had built in this harsh but beautiful country. "What do you need?" Running Bear asked simply. "Information," Eli replied. "And maybe a way to move around without being seen," the old chief smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "In winter we know paths that not even the spirits use. This Barrow's men see only what is in front of them. They do not understand that the mountain has memory, and memory has teeth." Swift Hawk was Running Bear's grandson, a young warrior who moved through the forest like smoke given form. He'd grown up hunting these mountains and knew every cave, every hidden trail, every place where a man could disappear and emerge miles away without leaving a track. When he volunteered to guide Eli through the network of ancient paths that connected the high country, it was like being given a map to an invisible world. "My grandfather says you fight with honor," Swifthawk told him as they moved through a narrow canyon that didn't appear on any white man's chart. "He says the spirits of your woman and child call for justice." Eli had told Running Bear about Sarah's condition before she died, and the old chief had grieved with him in the way of men who understood that some losses cut too deep for words. In the Blackfoot tradition, the murder of a pregnant woman was among the gravest of crimes, one that demanded blood payment from the entire family of the killer. "Your grandfather is wise," Eli replied, following the young brave along a ledge that seemed barely wide enough for a mountain goat. "But this isn't your fight. Any man who would kill a woman heavy with child is enemy to all people," Swifthawk said simply. "And Barrow's men have already begun stealing horses from our herds. They think we are weak because we do not ride to war immediately. That was the problem with men like Clay Barrow. They saw restraint as weakness, patience as cowardice. They never understood that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who took time to choose their battles carefully. The hidden trail brought them to an overlook above Barrow's supply convoy, a string of wagons making their way up the frozen road toward Dead Horse Creek. Eli counted 20 men riding guard, more than he'd expected, but not more than he could handle with the right approach. "They're carrying more than supplies," Swifthawk observed, pointing to the way the wagons rode low on their springs. "Ammunition, maybe weapons. Something heavy." Eli studied the convoy through his telescope, noting the spacing between the guards, the condition of their horses, the way they rode. These weren't the same caliber as the men he'd been picking off. These were professionals, alert and disciplined. Barrow was learning from his losses and upgrading his operation. "There," Eli said, pointing to a narrow section of the trail where it passed between 2 steep rock faces. "Classic choke point. They'll have to bunch up to get through, and the guards won't be able to spread out if trouble starts. Swifthawk grinned, understanding immediately. You want to take the whole convoy? I want to send Barrow a message he can't ignore, Eli replied. Show him that his money can't buy him safety up here. They spent the rest of the day preparing the ambush. Eli had learned the art of demolition during the war, and Swifthawk knew which rocks would tumble with the right encouragement. By evening, they had charges set at 3 strategic points along the narrow passage, positioned to create a rock slide that would block the trail and trap the convoy in a killing ground. The wagons arrived just after dawn, moving slowly through the treacherous footing of the mountain road. Eli waited until the lead riders were committed to the narrow passage before triggering the first charge. The explosion echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and tons of rock crashed down behind the convoy. Sealing off their retreat, chaos erupted as horses reared and men shouted orders. But Eli was already moving to his second position. The guards were good. They dismounted quickly and took cover, returning fire with disciplined volleys that kept his head down. But they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see in terrain they didn't understand. Swifthawk hit them from the opposite side, his rifle speaking with deadly precision as he picked off any man who showed himself in the open. The young warrior had learned to shoot from his grandfather, who'd learned from necessity during the Indian Wars, and his marksmanship was exceptional even by frontier standards. The battle lasted less than an hour. But when the smoke cleared, half of Barrow's escort was dead or wounded, and the entire convoy was either destroyed or captured. Eli found what he'd been hoping for in the lead wagon, a strongbox containing enough gold to fund a small army, along with correspondence that detailed Barrow's larger plans for the territory. The letters made for grim reading. Barrow wasn't just interested in Bitter Hollow. He wanted to control the entire Northern Valley system, driving out homesteaders, miners, and Indian tribes alike. He'd made deals with corrupt territorial officials, bribed judges, and even arranged for federal troops to be unavailable when complaints were filed against his operations. He's bought himself a small kingdom, Eli muttered, reading through the documents by firelight. And everyone in it is either working for him or marked for removal. But there was something else in the correspondence that caught his attention, references to a final solution for the Indian problem, and mentions of a man called Colonel Morrison, who was apparently coordinating with territorial militia units. Swifthawk read the letters over Eli's shoulder, his face growing darker with each page. This Morrison, I know this name. He led the attack on Crying Wolf's village 2 winters past. Killed women and children, claimed they were hiding stolen horses. Eli felt a familiar chill settle in his bones. He'd heard about the Crying Wolf massacre, one of those incidents that decent folks preferred not to discuss too openly. If Morrison was working with Barrow, it meant the cattle baron had military support for whatever he was planning. We need to get word to your grandfather, Eli said, folding the letters and tucking them inside his coat. If Barrow's planning something big, the tribe needs to be ready. What about you? Swifthawk asked. Will you come to our winter camp? Eli shook his head. I've got more hunting to do. But these letters, they're proof of what Barrow's really up to. When the time comes to present evidence, they might be the difference between justice and a cover-up. They parted ways at the canyon mouth, Swifthawk disappearing into the forest like a shadow while Eli headed back into the high country. But the game had changed now. What had started as personal revenge was becoming something larger, a war for the soul of the territory itself. Barrow had made the mistake of thinking he could buy his way out of any problem, but there were some things that money couldn't purchase. Justice was one of them, honor was another, and the third was the fury of a mountain man who'd lost everything that mattered to him and had nothing left to lose but his life. Clay Barrow was about to learn that some prices were paid in blood, and the mountain always collected its debts in full. Winter deepened into the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes if he made the wrong choice. But Eli Varn had become something beyond the reach of ordinary human frailty. He moved through the frozen landscape like a force of nature, striking without warning and vanishing before anyone could mount an effective response. The war in the mountains had become personal for every man wearing Clay Barrow's brand, and that was exactly what Eli wanted. Fear was a weapon he'd learned to wield with surgical precision during his cavalry days. A demoralized enemy made more mistakes, took fewer risks, and eventually started looking over their shoulders so much they forgot to watch what was in front of them. Barrow's men were already showing the signs, jumping at shadows, arguing among themselves, and requesting transfers to easier assignments that didn't exist. The latest kill had been his most audacious yet. Tom Brennan's brother, Jake, had arrived from Colorado with 5 men and a reputation for tracking down troublesome Indians and army deserters. He'd boasted in the saloons of Coyote Gulch that he'd bring back the mountain man's scalp within a week. And his confidence had infected Barrow's demoralized crew. Eli had let them track him for 3 days, leading them deeper into the high country along trails that grew progressively more treacherous. On the 4th morning, he doubled back through a canyon system that only the Blackfoot knew, emerging behind them while they studied his false trail like bloodhounds following a scent. Jake Brennan died with his rifle halfway to his shoulder, Eli's bullet taking him between the shoulder blades and pitching him forward into the snow. The others lasted longer, but not by much. Mountain fighting wasn't about quick draws and fancy gun work. It was about position, patience, and the willingness to do whatever it took to survive. When the shooting was over, Eli had carved a new message into a tree beside the bodies, 10 men dead. How many more, Mr. Barrow? But the killing was starting to weigh on him in ways he hadn't expected. Each face in his rifle sights reminded him of other faces from other wars, other times when he'd been forced to choose between his conscience and his survival. Sarah's memory sustained him, but he could feel something hardening inside his chest. A callousness that made each subsequent death easier to justify and harder to forget. The nightmares had started coming regularly now, not just dreams of Sarah's murder, but older ghosts from Shiloh and Antietam, from cavalry charges that had turned into slaughterhouses and retreats that had become routes. War changed a man in ways that peace could heal but never completely erase. And Eli was discovering that grief could reopen old wounds with surgical precision. He was camped in a cave system that Swift Hawk had shown him, deep enough in the mountain to be invisible from the outside, but with multiple exits in case he needed to leave quickly. The fire was small and smokeless, built from wood so dry it burned almost clean, and he was reading through Barrow's correspondence again when he heard the approach of moccasined feet on stone. Running Bear appeared at the cave mouth like a spirit materializing from the storm outside. The old chief moved with the careful dignity of a man whose bones remembered too many winters. But his eyes were sharp as obsidian and twice as hard. "My grandson tells me you found papers," Running Bear said without preamble. Settling himself beside the fire with a grunt of effort, Eli handed over the letters, watching the chief's face as he read through them by firelight. Running Bear's English was better than most people realized, a legacy of his years as a young warrior dealing with army negotiators who thought they could trick him with fancy words and false promises. "This Morrison," Running Bear said finally, tapping one of the documents with a gnarled finger. "He has been gathering men at Fort Benton. Militia, he calls them, but they are gunfighters and scalp hunters dressed in blue coats." "How many men?" Eli asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. Swift Hawk counted 50 when he scouted their camp. "More arriving each day." The chief's voice was steady, but Eli could see the concern in his eyes. "They speak of a winter campaign to clear the territory of hostile elements. 50 men, professional soldiers with military discipline and government backing." Eli felt a familiar sinking sensation in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had at Bull Run when he'd realized the enemy had more men, better position, and superior firepower. "When?" he asked. "The new moon. 5 days from now." Running Bear folded the letters and handed them back. My people are moving to the winter caves in the high country, but if Morrison finds our trails, he won't, Eli said with more confidence than he felt. I'll make sure of that. The old chief studied him with eyes that had seen too much of war and death. One man cannot stop 50, even a man who fights like 10. Maybe not, Eli admitted. But one man can make 50 think twice about what they're doing up here. Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if reading omens in the dancing flames. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions and hard-won wisdom. There is another way, he said slowly, but it would require you to trust in something more than guns and anger. Eli leaned forward, interested despite himself. What kind of way? My people have friends among the other tribes, Crow, Cheyenne, even some Sioux bands that winter in this country. If word were sent, if the right arguments were made, they might come together for a common cause. A war party? Eli asked, though he already knew the answer. Not war in the way white men understand it, Running Bear clarified. Something older, a gathering of peoples who have shared these mountains since before your ancestors dreamed of crossing the Great Water. The implications were staggering. An alliance of tribal forces would outnumber Morrison's militia by at least 2 to 1, and they'd be fighting on terrain they knew better than their own lodge fires. But it would also mean escalating the conflict beyond anything the territorial government could ignore, turning a local land dispute into something that might require federal intervention. The cost, Eli began. The cost of doing nothing is higher, Running Bear interrupted. Barrow and Morrison mean to drive us from this land permanently. If we do not make a stand now, there will be no second chance. Eli touched the wedding ring in his pocket, feeling the smooth gold that had once symbolized a future now lost forever. Sarah would have understood the choice he was facing. She'd always been able to see the larger picture, the connections between individual actions and their broader consequences. What would you need from me? He asked finally. Proof that white men and red men can fight together for something greater than revenge, Running Bear replied. And your word that when this is over, you will help us present our case to the territorial authorities. It was a leap of faith that would bind him to a cause larger than his personal grief, transforming his war of vengeance into something that might actually change the balance of power in the territory. But it also meant accepting responsibilities that extended far beyond settling accounts with Clay Barrow. You have it, Eli said, extending his hand to the old chief. Both. They shook hands beside the fire, sealing an alliance that would reshape the conflict in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. Outside the cave, the wind howled through the peaks like the voices of ancient spirits, and Eli wondered if Sarah's ghost was among them, watching as her husband chose a path that might finally lead to something resembling justice. The gathering took place in a hidden valley that existed in the spaces between territorial maps, a place where ancient hunting trails converged, and the spirits of the mountain were said to speak directly to those who knew how to listen. Representatives from 5 tribes had made the dangerous winter journey, their faces painted for war council and their weapons blessed by medicine men who remembered when the buffalo herds stretched beyond the horizon. Eli felt like an intruder at first, the only white man in a circle of warriors who had every reason to see him as just another land-hungry settler. But Running Bear had spoken for him, vouching for his character and his commitment to justice, and gradually the suspicion in their eyes had given way to cautious respect. The talking lasted 3 days. Each chief had to hear the full story, examine Barrow's letters, and debate the wisdom of taking up arms alongside a man whose people had been driving them from their ancestral lands for generations. There were heated arguments, passionate speeches, and moments when Eli thought the whole alliance would collapse into mutual recrimination and old grievances. But in the end, it was the simplest truth that carried the day. Clay Barrow and Colonel Morrison represented everything that was wrong with the way white civilization was expanding into the territory. The corruption, the greed, the willingness to use violence against anyone who stood in the way of profit. If they succeeded here, their methods would become the template for every other territorial dispute, and the tribes would find themselves fighting the same battle over and over until there was nowhere left to retreat. Grey Wolf, the Crow war chief, put it most succinctly: "This Barrow kills women with babies in their bellies. This Morrison burns villages and calls it justice. If we do not stop them here, who will stop them tomorrow?" The war party that emerged from the valley numbered nearly 100 warriors, moving through the winter landscape like ghosts given flesh and weapons. They split into smaller groups, each taking a different route toward the rendezvous point near Dead Horse Creek, using paths that had been walked by their ancestors for thousands of years. Eli rode with Swifthawk and a dozen Blackfoot warriors, learning their methods of winter warfare as they moved through country that would have been impassable to conventional cavalry. These men could travel 20 miles a day through snow that would stop a white man's horse, living off cached supplies and emergency rations that sustained them in conditions that would kill most soldiers. But the closer they got to the coming confrontation, the more Eli found himself wrestling with doubts that had nothing to do with military tactics or strategic planning. He'd started this war to avenge Sarah's murder, but it had grown into something far larger, a conflict that might reshape the balance of power in the entire territory. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like the mountain air, thin and hard to breathe. "You think too much," Swifthawk observed as they made camp on their final night before the attack. "My grandfather says it is the curse of educated men. They see all the ways things can go wrong instead of focusing on the one way they can go right." "And what's the one way this can go right?" Eli asked, stirring the coals of their small fire. "Barrow dies. Morrison dies. Their men scatter like rabbits before wolves." Swifthawk's grin was wolfish in the firelight. "Everything else can be settled after the shooting stops." It was the kind of simple wisdom that cut through complexity like a sharp knife, and Eli envied the young warrior his certainty. But 30 years of fighting had taught him that battles rarely ended the way anyone expected, and the consequences of violence had a way of spreading far beyond the original combatants. Still, when morning came and the war party took their positions around Dead Horse Creek, Eli felt the familiar calm that always descended on him before action. All the planning and worrying was finished. Now there was only the fight itself, and the knowledge that he was finally going to settle accounts with the men who'd murdered his wife. Morrison's militia had arrived during the night. 50 men in blue coats who'd set up a proper military camp with sentries and picket lines. They looked professional and disciplined, veterans of Indian campaigns who knew their business and weren't easily rattled. But they were also strangers to this particular country, and they'd positioned themselves in a valley that could become a trap if the right pressure was applied at the right points. The attack began at dawn, but not in the way Morrison expected. Instead of a frontal assault on his fortified position, the tribal warriors hit his horse herd first, stampeding the animals and stranding his men on foot in deep snow. Then they struck his supply wagons, destroying ammunition and provisions that would be impossible to replace before spring. By the time Morrison realized he was facing an organized force rather than random raiders, his command was already scattered and demoralized. His men were good soldiers, but they'd been trained to fight conventional enemies on open ground, not ghosts who appeared and vanished among the rocks and trees. Eli took personal charge of the assault on Barrow's compound, leading a mixed force of Blackfoot and Crow warriors in a pre-dawn attack that caught the cattle baron's men completely off guard. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, the kind of combat where experience and desperation mattered more than fancy weapons or military training. He found Clay Barrow himself in the main building, trying to burn documents while gunfire raged outside. The cattle baron was smaller than Eli had expected, soft around the middle and pale with fear, clutching a nickel-plated revolver that shook in his hands like a leaf in a high wind. "You're the mountain man," Barrow said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who's been killing my men. I'm the husband of the woman you murdered." Eli replied, his own gun steady as granite. "And I'm here to collect the debt you owe." Barrow's eyes darted toward the window, calculating his chances of escape, but there was nowhere to run. The sound of battle was moving closer, and both men could hear the war cries of the tribal warriors as they overran the last pockets of resistance. "I can pay you," Barrow said desperately. "More money than you've ever seen. Enough to buy your own ranch, your own town if you want it." Eli thought about Sarah's wedding ring in his pocket, about the baby that would never be born, about the peaceful life that had been stolen from them by this man's greed and ambition. "Some things aren't for sale," he said quietly, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the building and out into the winter morning, marking the end of Clay Barrow's empire and the beginning of something new in the territory. But as Eli stood over the body of his wife's killer, he felt none of the satisfaction he'd expected, only a hollow emptiness where his rage had been, and the uncertain knowledge that vengeance was a poor substitute for the life he'd lost. The papers Clay Barrow had been trying to burn, when he died, told a story that changed everything Eli thought he knew about his wife's murder. Hidden among the routine correspondence about cattle purchases and territorial bribes was a single letter that made his blood run cold. Written in Sarah's own careful handwriting and dated just 2 weeks before her death. "Mr. Barrow," the letter began, "I am writing to you against my husband's wishes, but I believe that reasonable people can find reasonable solutions to their differences. Eli does not know about this correspondence, and I would prefer to keep it that way until we can arrange a meeting to discuss terms." Eli's hands shook as he read the words that overturned everything he'd believed about the night his world ended. Sarah hadn't been an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of Barrow's expansion. She'd been trying to negotiate a peaceful settlement behind his back, believing that she could find a way to save their home without violence. The letter continued in Sarah's distinctive voice, the same tone she'd used when talking him out of his darker moods after particularly bad nightmares about the war. "I understand your position, and I sympathize with the challenges of building a business in this territory. My husband is a proud man who has seen too much violence, and he cannot separate his memories of the war from the current situation. But I am with child now, and the prospect of raising a family in the middle of a range war fills me with dread." She'd known about the baby when she wrote the letter, known and tried to use that knowledge to forge a peace that would protect their future. Eli felt something crack inside his chest as he realized how completely he'd failed to understand the woman he'd loved more than his own life. "I propose a meeting at our cabin, just the two of us, to discuss compensation for any inconvenience our presence might cause your plans. I'm confident that we can reach an arrangement that satisfies everyone involved. After all, there is surely enough land in this vast territory for all of us to prosper." The innocence of that statement, the faith in human decency that had led Sarah to invite her own killer into their home, hit Eli like a physical blow. She'd been trying to save their marriage, their unborn child, their future, by appealing to whatever conscience Clay Barrow might have possessed. But the response letter, in Barrow's heavy scrawl, revealed just how catastrophically she'd misjudged the man she was dealing with. "Mrs. Vaughn, I appreciate your initiative in reaching out, and I would be happy to discuss terms for your husband's departure from Bitter Hollow. However, I must insist that our meeting remain completely confidential. If word of these negotiations reaches your husband or anyone else, I will be forced to conclude that you are not negotiating in good faith. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cooperate in secret or face the consequences." Barrow had been planning Sarah's murder even as he agreed to meet with her, using her own desire for peace as the weapon that would destroy her. A final document made the full scope of the betrayal clear. It was a report from one of Barrow's men, describing the events of that terrible night in clinical detail. "Boss, the woman was expecting you just like you arranged. She had coffee ready and everything, thought she was going to talk business. When she realized what was really happening, she tried to run, but Brennan caught her before she made it to the door. She fought hard for someone in her condition, scratched up Jake's face pretty good before he got her under control. The report went on to describe how they'd searched the cabin for valuables before setting it on fire, treating Sarah's murder as nothing more than a business transaction that had gotten slightly messier than expected. The casual tone, the complete absence of any recognition that they'd killed a pregnant woman who'd been trying to save her family, filled Eli with a rage so pure it felt like molten metal in his veins. But there was one more revelation waiting in the burned papers, one that explained everything that had happened since. The letter was signed not by Clay Barrow, but by someone identified only as the Syndicate, and it outlined a plan that dwarfed anything Eli had imagined. Mr. Barrow, your efforts to secure the Northern Valleys are proceeding according to schedule, but certain territorial officials are beginning to ask inconvenient questions about your methods. We are therefore implementing the Morrison Protocol, which will provide legal cover for all future operations. The Morrison Protocol, as outlined in subsequent documents, was a scheme to use false flag operations and manufactured incidents to justify military action against hostile elements in the territory. Colonel Morrison wasn't just a corrupt officer looking to make some extra money. He was the centerpiece of a conspiracy that reached all the way to Washington, involving railroad interests, mining concerns, and territorial politicians who stood to profit from the systematic displacement of homesteaders and tribal communities. Sarah's murder hadn't been about Clay Barrow's cattle empire. It had been about creating the kind of violence that would justify Morrison's winter campaign. The syndicate behind the plan needed examples of savage atrocities to present to territorial authorities, and a pregnant woman killed by hostile Indians would have provided perfect justification for the coming genocide. The fact that Eli had turned the tables and started killing Barrows men had actually served their purposes better than they'd hoped. Now they could point to an escalating cycle of violence that required immediate military intervention, painting both the tribal alliance and Eli himself as dangerous insurgents who threatened the safety of law-abiding settlers. Swift Hawk found him sitting among the burned papers as dawn broke over the destroyed compound. The young warrior took one look at Eli's face and knew that something fundamental had changed. "What did you find?" Swift Hawk asked quietly. Eli handed him Sarah's letter without speaking. As the Blackfoot warrior read through the careful words of a woman trying to save her family, his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to a cold anger that matched Eli's own. "She tried to make peace," Swifthawk said finally. "She tried to make peace, and they killed her for it," Eli confirmed. "But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that her murder was never about Barrow's land grab. It was about starting a war that would give the territorial government an excuse to wipe out every homesteader and Indian in the Northern Valleys. The implications were staggering. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd accomplished in the past few days, had been anticipated and planned for by people who were using their justified anger as a tool to achieve their own ends. The tribal alliance that Eli had thought was a victory for justice was actually playing into the hands of men who wanted nothing more than an excuse to implement their final solution to the Indian problem. "Morrison," Swifthawk said, understanding immediately. "Morrison's just the weapon," Eli replied grimly. "But the hand holding it reaches a lot higher than we thought." As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, Eli realized that killing Clay Barrow had solved nothing. If anything, it had accelerated a timeline that would soon see federal troops pouring into the territory with orders to restore order by any means necessary. The real enemy wasn't a corrupt cattle baron or even a murderous colonel. It was a system designed to turn justice into justification for genocide, and Sarah's blood was on the hands of every man who'd voted to implement it. The war council that convened in the ruins of Dead Horse Creek was unlike any gathering the territory had ever seen. Tribal chiefs sat beside mountain men, army deserters shared intelligence with Indian scouts, and the normal divisions of race and allegiance dissolved in the face of a common enemy that threatened them all. Word had spread fast about the documents Eli had discovered, and representatives from communities throughout the northern valleys had made the dangerous journey. To hear the truth about the Morrison Protocol, Running Bear presided over the gathering with the dignity of a man who'd spent his entire life preparing for this moment. The old chief had seen enough of white man's justice to know the difference between law and legal cover, and the papers that outlined the syndicate's plans confirmed his worst fears about the territorial government's intentions. "They mean to kill us all," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. "Not just the tribes, but anyone who stands between them and the land they want. The homesteaders, the miners, the trappers, we are all obstacles to be removed." Eli stood beside the chief, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. The revelation that Sarah's murder had been part of a larger conspiracy had transformed his personal quest for vengeance into something that affected thousands of lives across the territory. The documents in his possession were the only evidence that could expose the syndicate's true intentions. But getting that evidence to honest authorities would require surviving the coming confrontation with Morrison's forces. "How long before Morrison realizes his plan has gone wrong?" asked Tom Henderson, a grizzled prospector who'd walked 50 miles through snow to attend the meeting. "He already knows," Eli replied grimly. "Barrow was supposed to report in yesterday. When he doesn't, Morrison will assume the worst and move to the next phase of his operation. The next phase, according to the captured documents, involved a coordinated assault on tribal winter camps and homesteader settlements throughout the valley system. Morrison had positioned units at strategic points to cut off escape routes, planning to present territorial authorities with a fait accompli, a pacified region where troublesome elements had been eliminated. "For the greater good, we can't fight the whole territorial militia," said Grey Wolf, the Crow war chief whose men had distinguished themselves in the assault on Barrow's compound. "Our victory here was possible because we chose the ground and had surprise on our side. In open battle, their numbers and weapons will overwhelm us. Then we don't fight them on their terms," Eli said, pulling out a hand-drawn map of the territory. "We make them come to us, where we can control the battlefield." The plan that emerged from hours of debate was audacious in its scope and desperate in its execution. Instead of dispersing to their winter camps and hoping to weather Morrison's assault, the Allied force would consolidate at Echo Canyon, a narrow defile that controlled access to the high country where most of the tribal communities had taken refuge. It was a defensive position that even a large force would struggle to assault, but it was also a trap if things went wrong. "If we make our stand there, there's no retreat," Running Bear observed. "We hold the canyon or we die in it. Sometimes that's the only choice that matters," Eli replied, thinking of Sarah's wedding ring in his pocket and the child who would never be born. "At least our deaths will mean something." Preparations began immediately. The tribal warriors understood mountain warfare better than any army unit, but they needed time to position their forces and prepare the kind of defenses that could withstand a prolonged siege. Women and children were evacuated to hidden caves deeper in the high country, along with essential supplies and the precious documents that might someday serve as evidence of the syndicate's crimes. Eli found himself in the strange position of serving as a bridge between two worlds, translating military concepts for chiefs who thought in terms of honor and courage, while helping army veterans understand tactics that had been developed over centuries of warfare in impossible terrain. His cavalry experience proved invaluable in planning the defense, but it was the tribal knowledge of the land itself that made the plan feasible. Swift Hawk had been chosen to carry word of the syndicate's conspiracy to the territorial capital, a journey that would take him through some of the most dangerous country in the West during the worst weather of the winter. It was likely a suicide mission, but the young warrior had volunteered without hesitation, understanding that exposing the truth was more important than any individual survival. "If I don't make it through," Swifthawk told Eli on the night before his departure, "make sure the story is told. Make sure people know that we died fighting for something more than ourselves." "You'll make it through," Eli replied, though they both knew the odds were against it. "You're too stubborn to let a little snow and some corrupt politicians stop you," the young Blackfoot warrior grinned, but his eyes were serious. "And you're too angry to die before you finish this fight. I think that makes us even." As Swifthawk disappeared into the swirling snow, Eli wondered if he'd ever see the young man again. The war had already cost too many good people their lives, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Morrison's forces arrived at Echo Canyon 3 days later, a column of blue-coated soldiers moving with the mechanical precision of professional military units. From his position among the rocks above the canyon entrance, Eli could see the colonel himself, a tall man with graying whiskers and the kind of rigid posture that came from decades of military service. He rode at the head of his column like a conqueror entering a defeated city, confident in his superior numbers and firepower. But Morrison wasn't just bringing soldiers to the fight. Behind the main column came wagons filled with territorial officials, newspaper correspondents, and other witnesses who were apparently meant to observe the pacification of the hostile elements threatening peaceful settlement. The syndicate had prepared for every eventuality, including the need to justify their actions to a broader audience. "They're planning to make an example of us," Running Bear observed, watching the approaching force through Eli's telescope. "Kill us all, then tell the world we were dangerous savages who threatened innocent settlers. Then we'll have to disappoint them," Eli replied, checking his rifle one last time. "Are your men ready?" "They have been ready since their grandfathers first saw white soldiers in this country," the chief answered. "The question is whether you are ready to see this through to the end." Eli thought about the question as he watched Morrison deploy his forces in a textbook assault formation. The colonel was clearly a competent officer who'd done this before, probably during the Indian Wars that had shaped the military's approach to frontier conflicts. He would attack by the book, using overwhelming force to crush resistance quickly and decisively. But Echo Canyon wasn't a typical Indian village or isolated homestead. It was a fortress that had been prepared by people who understood both modern warfare and ancient tactics, defended by an alliance that represented everything the syndicate was trying to destroy. The fight that was coming would determine not just the fate of the Northern Territories, but the kind of society that would emerge from the violence. As the first shots echoed off the canyon walls and the battle for the soul of the territory began in earnest, Eli touched Sarah's ring one last time and wondered if she would have approved of the choice he'd made. Then the time for wondering was over, and there was only the fight itself, brutal, desperate, and absolutely necessary. Morrison had come to the canyon expecting to face a rabble of disorganized savages and mountain hermits. Instead, he was about to learn what happened when free people decided they'd rather die fighting than live on their knees. The lesson was going to be written in blood and carved into the living rock of the mountains themselves, a testament to the idea that some things were worth more than life itself. Justice was one of them. Honor was another. And the third was the simple right to live free on the land that had shaped your people for generations beyond counting. The first assault came at dawn, with Morrison's forces advancing in parade ground formation up the narrow canyon floor. It was exactly the kind of textbook maneuver that worked perfectly against conventional enemies. But Echo Canyon had been prepared by men who understood that rules were meant to be broken when survival was at stake. Eli waited until the lead elements were committed to the killing ground before giving the signal. The canyon walls erupted in rifle fire, muzzle flashes blinking like deadly stars among the rocks as tribal warriors and mountain men opened up from positions that had been carefully prepared over the past 3 days. The crossfire was devastating, catching Morrison's men in an overlapping field of fire that left nowhere to hide and no room to maneuver. The slaughter was over in minutes. Morrison's advance guard, 2 full companies of territorial militia, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, their bodies scattered across the canyon floor like broken dolls. The survivors stumbled back toward the main force, carrying word of the disaster to a colonel who'd never faced this kind of organized resistance from hostiles. But Eli took no satisfaction from the victory. Each dead soldier was someone's son or husband, men who'd probably signed up believing they were serving a just cause. The real enemy, the syndicate pulling Morrison's strings, remained safely distant from the consequences of their decisions, counting profits while other people paid the blood price for their schemes. First blood to us, Running Bear observed, reloading his ancient Springfield with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been fighting losing battles for most of his adult life. But Morrison has more men than we have bullets. It was the fundamental problem with their defensive strategy. They could win individual engagements, but they couldn't sustain a prolonged fight against an enemy with superior numbers and supply lines. Every bullet they fired was irreplaceable. Every casualty they suffered weakened their already thin ranks. Morrison seemed to understand the mathematics as well. His second assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, with units advancing up side canyons that Eli's scouts had thought were impassable. The colonel was learning from his initial failure, adapting his tactics to the terrain in ways that showed real military competence. The fighting became a series of desperate skirmishes as tribal warriors fell back from position to position, buying time with their lives while their families retreated deeper into the mountain strongholds. Eli found himself commanding a mixed force of Blackfoot and Crow warriors, army deserters and mountain men who'd never taken orders from anyone but were united by their hatred of everything Morrison represented. "Hold! The North Ridge!" he shouted to Grey Wolf as another wave of blue-coated soldiers appeared at the canyon mouth. "Don't let them flank our main position." The Crow war chief nodded grimly, gathering his remaining warriors for what would probably be their final stand. They'd started the day with 30 men. Now they were down to fewer than 20, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Morrison's third assault nearly broke through the defensive line. His men had learned to use the canyon's natural features for cover, advancing in small groups that were harder to target effectively. They'd also brought up artillery, a mountain howitzer that could punch holes in the stone breastworks the defenders had built among the rocks. The first shell exploded just above Eli's position, showering him with granite fragments and filling the air with choking dust. The second one killed 3 Blackfoot warriors who'd been holding the center of the line, opening a gap that Morrison's infantry immediately tried to exploit. "Fall back to the second line," Eli ordered, though he wondered if there would be enough men left to make a second line meaningful. They'd inflicted terrible casualties on Morrison's forces, but the colonel seemed willing to spend his men's lives like water to achieve his objectives. As the defenders pulled back to their prepared positions higher up the canyon walls, Eli caught sight of Morrison himself, directing the assault from a safe distance behind his advancing troops. The colonel was close enough that a good shot might take him out, but he was also surrounded by enough bodyguards to make any assassination attempt suicidal. Still, the temptation was almost overwhelming. Morrison was the head of the Snake, the man whose death might end the immediate threat to the tribal communities and homesteader settlements. But Eli knew that killing him would only create a martyr for the syndicate to use, another justification for the genocidal policies they were trying to implement. The real victory would come from exposing the conspiracy itself, proving that Morrison and his backers were the true criminals in this conflict. But that would require surviving long enough for Swifthawk to reach the territorial capital with the evidence. And survival was looking increasingly unlikely as Morrison's forces closed in on the final defensive positions. Running Bear appeared at Eli's elbow, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that they were running out of options. My grandson should have reached the settlements by now, the old chief said quietly. If he made it through the passes. He made it, Eli replied, with more confidence than he felt. Swifthawk's too stubborn to let a little snow stop him. But as Morrison's artillery found their range and began systematically destroying their defensive positions, Eli wondered if any of them would live long enough to see justice done. The sound of approaching cavalry came like thunder rolling across the canyon floor, but it wasn't Morrison's reinforcements charging up the narrow defile. The riders wore the blue uniforms of the territorial government, but the man leading them carried a flag of truce instead of a battle standard, and his face bore the grim expression of someone who'd learned terrible truths about the men he'd been sent to support. Captain James Mitchell of the Territorial Guard had ridden through 3 days of blizzard conditions to reach Echo Canyon, driven by evidence that Swifthawk had delivered to the territorial capital, along with his own testimony about the conspiracy behind Morrison's campaign. The young Blackfoot warrior had not only survived his desperate journey, he'd managed to reach the one honest official in the territorial government who had the authority to stop the massacre. Colonel Morrison, Mitchell called out, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. By order of Territorial Governor Harrison, you are to cease all offensive operations immediately and place yourself under arrest for conspiracy to commit genocide and violation of federal treaty obligations. Morrison's face went white as he realized that his carefully constructed cover story was collapsing around him. The documents that were supposed to have been destroyed with Barrow were now in the hands of authorities who could read between the lines of bureaucratic language and see the true scope of the syndicates. The plans, Captain Mitchell, Morrison replied, trying to maintain his composure. I'm afraid you've been misled by hostile propaganda. These people are dangerous insurgents who have already murdered dozens of innocent settlers. My orders come directly from... Your orders come from a criminal conspiracy that has been exposed, Mitchell interrupted, dismounting from his horse with deliberate precision. The governor has seen the evidence, Colonel. We know about the Morrison Protocol. We know about the syndicate. And we know that you've been using federal resources to commit mass murder in the name of territorial development. The confrontation between the two officers played out in full view of both armies, and Eli could see the effect it was having on Morrison's men. These were soldiers who'd enlisted to serve their country, not to participate in a genocidal land grab disguised as law enforcement. The revelation that they'd been lied to and manipulated was written on their faces as clearly as if it had been carved in stone. Stand down, all of you, Mitchell ordered, addressing Morrison's forces directly. Any man who continues to follow illegal orders will be considered a participant in this conspiracy and prosecuted accordingly. Morrison's hand moved toward his sidearm, but he found himself staring down the barrels of a dozen rifles as his own men turned their weapons on him. The careful discipline that had made his forces effective in battle now worked against him as soldiers who'd been trained to follow legitimate authority recognized that he no longer represented it. You don't understand what you're doing, Morrison said desperately. These territories need to be developed. The railroad, the mining interests, the cattle ranchers, they're the future. These savages and squatters are just obstacles to progress. Progress built on murdered pregnant women isn't progress, Eli called out from his position among the rocks. It's just murder with a better marketing campaign. He climbed down from the defensive positions, his rifle held ready but not threatening, and walked toward the cluster of officers in the canyon below. Running Bear and Grey Wolf followed him, their warriors emerging from cover with the careful caution of men who'd learned not to trust white men's promises too quickly. You must be Eli Varn, Captain Mitchell said, extending his hand. Swifthawk told us about you. About what really happened to your wife. Eli shook the offered hand, studying Mitchell's face for signs of deception or hidden agendas. But the captain's eyes were steady and honest, and Swifthawk wouldn't have trusted him if he'd been anything other than genuine. The evidence is strong enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, Mitchell continued. but we'll need testimony from the survivors to make sure everyone involved pays for their crimes. What about our people? Running Bear asked, speaking for the first time since the shooting had stopped. Will the government honor its treaties, or will there be another colonel next year with a different excuse for taking our lands? Mitchell's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question. That will depend on what happens next. The territorial government is going to need to rebuild its credibility after this scandal. Honoring existing treaties and negotiating fair settlements for past grievances would be a good place to start. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was more than any of them had dared hope for when the fighting started. The immediate threat was over, the conspiracy was exposed, and there was at least a chance that justice might prevail over the raw greed that had driven so much of the territory's development. As Morrison was led away in chains and his demoralized forces began their withdrawal from the canyon, Eli touched Sarah's wedding ring one last time and wondered if his wife would have approved of how their story had ended. The violence was over, but the real work of building a just society was just beginning. Spring came early to Bitter Hollow that year, melting the snows that had covered Sarah's grave through the long winter of violence and revelation. Eli stood beside the cairn he'd built over her remains, holding a letter from the territorial capital that confirmed what Captain Mitchell had promised. The syndicate's conspiracy had been fully exposed, its members either imprisoned or fled to avoid prosecution, and the territorial government had committed to honoring existing treaties while negotiating fair compensation for past grievances. Justice, it seemed, was more than just a word after all. The trial had lasted 3 months, with testimony from dozens of witnesses who'd suffered under the syndicate's schemes. Morrison himself had broken under questioning, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy in exchange for a life sentence instead of the hangman's noose. The railroad interests, mining companies, and corrupt officials who'd funded the operation faced financial ruin and federal prosecution. Their dreams of easy profits buried under an avalanche of evidence and public outrage. But for Eli, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the changes that were already taking shape across the territory. Running Bear's people had been granted permanent rights to their traditional hunting grounds, with federal guarantees that would be harder for future politicians to ignore. The homesteaders who'd been driven from their land were being compensated and invited to return, their property rights protected by new territorial laws that closed the loopholes the syndicate had exploited. Swift Hawk had become something of a celebrity, his desperate winter journey transformed into legend by newspaper accounts that portrayed him as a heroic messenger who'd saved countless lives by exposing the truth. The young Blackfoot warrior handled the attention with characteristic humor, insisting that anyone could have done what he'd done if they'd been stubborn enough to keep moving, when the smart thing would have been to find shelter and wait for spring. Besides, he told Eli during one of their conversations, riding through a blizzard is easier than explaining to my grandfather why I let a bunch of corrupt white men get away with murder. The cabin Eli was building on the site of his old home was smaller than the one he'd shared with Sarah, but it felt right somehow. A place for reflection rather than the dreams of a family that would never be. He'd thought about leaving Bitter Hollow entirely, starting over somewhere that didn't carry so many painful memories. But something kept him anchored to this particular piece of mountain country. Maybe it was Sarah's presence, which he still felt sometimes in the evening mist that rose from the valley floor. Maybe it was the responsibility he'd accepted when he'd joined forces with Running Bear and the other chiefs, a commitment to help build the kind of society that could prevent future tragedies. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that running away from grief was just another form of surrender. And he'd surrendered enough for one lifetime. The letter in his pocket was from Tom Henderson, the old prospector who'd become an unofficial spokesman for the homesteader community. The territorial government was forming a commission to oversee the implementation of the new policies. and they wanted Eli to serve as a liaison between the various communities that had been affected by the syndicate's operations. It was the kind of bureaucratic position that would have horrified his younger self. But it was also an opportunity to ensure that the changes they'd fought for weren't quietly reversed when public attention moved on to other issues. "You thinking about taking that job?" Running Bear asked, appearing at the edge of the clearing with the silent footsteps that seemed to be a tribal specialty. Eli folded the letter and tucked it back into his pocket. "I'm thinking about it. Someone needs to keep an eye on these politicians. Make sure they remember their promises." "Good," the old chief said, settling himself on a fallen log with the careful movements of a man whose bones had endured too many winters. "My people have learned not to trust white man's justice, but you have walked between both worlds. Maybe you can help build a bridge that will last longer than the men who make it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed so much violence and change. The evening was peaceful in a way that would have been impossible during the Winter War, filled with the ordinary sounds of a world returning to normal. Birds calling from the trees, wind rustling through new leaves, the distant splash of beaver working in the creek. "She would have liked this," Eli said finally, touching the spot where Sarah's wedding ring rested in his pocket. "The peace, I mean. The idea that we actually accomplished something." "She helped accomplish it," Running Bear replied. "Her death was the first injustice, the one that started you on the path that led to all the others being exposed. Without her courage in trying to make peace, without your love for her memory, the syndicate would still be operating, and more people would be dead." It was a comforting thought, the idea that Sarah's murder hadn't been meaningless after all, that it had been the spark that ignited a fire that eventually consumed the corrupt system that had killed her. But Eli knew that comfort was dangerous, that the moment he started believing the ends justified the means was the moment he began thinking like the men he'd fought against. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. Sarah had died because evil men had chosen to kill her, and everything that followed had been an attempt to restore some kind of balance to a world that had been tilted toward darkness. The justice they'd achieved was real, but it couldn't bring back the dead or undo the suffering that had made it necessary. As the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Eli made his decision about the Territorial Commission. He would take the job, not because he believed in the perfectibility of human institutions, but because someone needed to stand watch over the fragile peace they'd managed to build. It wasn't the life he'd planned with Sarah, but it was a life that honored her memory and served something larger than his own grief. And sometimes that was enough.